When they entered the mansion, it was only then that Chanty and Jake's lips parted. But at that moment, Chanty wasn't in the mood for anything more to happen between them. She could only offer him a kiss. Jake gently laid her on the floor, hugging her tightly, showering her face and lips with kisses. God knows I miss you so much, my love. Thank you for coming even just for a short while, Jake said with a voice filled with sincerity and longing as he gazed deeply into her eyes. Chanty smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Her chest still felt heavy. The pain she was feeling at that moment was unbearable, as though she was being pierced repeatedly. She couldn't understand her emotions. Jake, noticing her mood, asked, "My love, have you eaten? Let me prepare your favorite dish quickly. Wait here, okay? I'll make something for you," Jake said, planting a kiss on her lips before guiding her to sit on the sofa. As Jake walked to the kitchen, Chanty heard the elven staff washing the dishes. She glanced at their large portrait on the wall, a wedding photo of her and Jake, and tears streamed down her face. First, their marriage no longer held any validity, their union couldn't be legally recognized. Jake could never truly claim her, and she could never claim him. Second, she had betrayed him, not once but twice. The guilt Chanty felt was immeasurable. The same pain caused to her by Vasper and Samara, she had inflicted upon Jake. As she sobbed while looking at their portrait, Jake returned from the kitchen. He saw Chanty crying, gazing at the image of them together. He immediately embraced her as he reached her side. Jake sat down and pulled Chanty into his lap. "It's okay, my love. As long as we love each other, nothing can separate us, not even the annulment of our marriage. What matters most is our feelings for one another," Jake said as he held Chanty close. Chanty hugged him tightly. "I'm so sorry, Jake. I'm sorry for all the mistakes I've made against you," Chanty said through her sobs. Jake embraced her even tighter. "Please, stop thinking about all the bad things. You've done nothing wrong to me, Chanty. This is all fate's doing," Jake reassured her. He gently pulled her back slightly so their eyes could meet. "I love you so much, and that's what's important. I love you deeply, and I'm willing to do anything for you," he said earnestly. Chanty just stared at Jake. At that moment, they noticed the elves serving food on the dining table. Jake stood up, carrying Chanty in his arms, cradling her as he walked to the dining area. The elves served dishes for two. "I'll eat with you, even though I already ate earlier, so you won't eat alone," Jake said as he gently placed Chanty in a chair. Chanty gazed at him tenderly. Before Jake sat down, he leaned in and kissed Chanty passionately on the lips. Then, they ate together. Jake served Chanty her favorite pasta, the same dish Vasper used to prepare for her. At that moment, she felt like fate was mocking her. Even the steak on the table was her favorite. "These are your favorites, right? I always have these prepared here because they've become my favorites too. It feels like you're with me whenever I eat them," Jake said, making Chanty's feelings even more conflicted. She forced herself not to show any reaction, struggling to compose herself. As they ate, Jake talked about the ongoing renovations in Chanty's mansion and updates about the vineyard. "Samara keeps demanding to talk to you. She's been looking for Vasper and keeps pestering David. They've been arguing a lot at the vineyard," Jake shared. Chanty grew concerned for David. "How's David? Can't he just send his secretary to the vineyard so he doesn't have to see Samara?" Jake smiled. "Don't worry, David can handle her," he reassured. Jake then asked about Chanty's training, and she shared her experiences, especially about Lauren. When Jake asked if Lauren was bothering her, Chanty denied it, saying Lauren didn't pay attention to her anymore and just ignored her. Jake seemed relieved to hear this. When they finished eating, Chanty asked, "How's Lorena?" "I brought her back to David," Jake replied. Chanty nodded. The elves cleaned up after their meal, and Jake and Chanty went to their room. It was clear that Jake missed Chanty deeply, but Chanty was troubled. She wasn't in the mood to be intimate with Jake because she had just been with Vasper. Guilt and sorrow weighed heavily on her heart. Jake's lips, desperate for her, kissed Chanty as they stood by the bed. His embraces were demanding and consuming, filled with longing, love, and desire, igniting the heat within him. But Chanty's tears began to fall, and she started crying, causing Jake to stop and pull back. He cupped her chin to meet her gaze. "Why? I'm sorry. Did I do something you didn't like?" Jake asked gently, his voice soft and filled with concern. Chanty looked at him and touched his lips, her hand trembling as it traced the warmth and softness of his lips. Jake held her hand against his lips. "Jake, forgive me for my shortcomings, for my mistakes against you." "Please forgive me," Chanty said. Jake, confused, lifted her into his lap as he sat on the bed, with Chanty straddling him. "Please don't say that," Jake said softly. "You've done nothing wrong to me. I'm the one who's at fault. I'm the one who forced myself into your life, even though I knew he still held your heart. Yet, I pushed my way in," Jake said, looking straight into Chanty's tear-filled eyes. Jake wiped her tears with both hands, his touch filled with gentleness and love. Then he kissed her lips warmly and reverently, conveying his love and devotion. "Jake, I don't know when my heart will heal," Chanty admitted. "He's the one who brought me here," she added, silencing Jake. Jake was stunned by this revelation. Chanty then confessed everything that had happened between her and Vasper at the beach, including the matter of the Sylvan Concord and the flowers of passion. Jake couldn't respond, he just stared at Chanty as tears streamed down her face. Crying, Chanty got off Jake's lap, but he refused to let her go. He held her tightly, embracing her as tears silently rolled down his cheeks. Chanty felt his silent sobs through his trembling shoulders, making her cry even harder. The guilt and pain she felt for Jake grew unbearable. She would have preferred Jake to lash out at her, to express his anger, rather than remain silent and cry. Her conscience weighed heavily on her chest. "I deserve to be left, Jake. Please, leave me. My life is miserable. I don't deserve you. What Vasper did to me, I've done the same to you," Chanty sobbed. Jake tightened his embrace around Chanty, his sobs finally breaking free. Hearing Jake's cries, Chanty felt a deep pain in her chest, as though it were being squeezed. "Jake, I don't deserve your love. I can't reciprocate the feelings you have for me," Chanty confessed, her voice trembling. Jake didn't respond with words. Instead, he clung to her even tighter, his tears soaking her shoulder. Chanty, moved by his vulnerability, wrapped her arms around him as well. "Thank you," Jake whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. "Thank you for choosing me in the end. That's enough for me. Just don't let go. I can't lose you. I can't bear it." Chanty wept harder, their shared grief filling the room. "I never lost hope that one day you'd forget about him completely and give me your whole heart," Jake said softly, looking directly into Chanty's tear-filled eyes. Chanty couldn't stop crying. She felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Jake gently stroked her hair and wiped her tears with a tissue from the bedside table. "Am I really here with you?" Chanty asked hesitantly, still feeling ashamed of her weakness toward the temptations of Vasper Mondragon. "No," Jake replied with a small smile, his tone both comforting and teasing. "He only touched your skin, but he didn't claim you. Remember, you're still a virgin." Chanty stayed silent, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Can I see the sword of destiny?" Jake asked softly. Without a word, Chanty raised her right hand, and the sword materialized, its radiant energy illuminating their bodies. Jake smiled as they both gazed at the glowing weapon. "Thank you for not hiding anything from me," Jake said, his voice steady and sincere. "That means more to me than anything else. And thank you for choosing me," he added, his smile warm and genuine. Chanty looked at Jake, overwhelmed by his unwavering love and understanding. "From this day forward, let's consider this the first day of our new relationship," Jake said. Chanty remained silent, her heart full of gratitude for Jake's patience and acceptance. She felt his unconditional love wrap around her like a shield. Overcome with emotion, she hugged him tightly, as the sword vanished from her hand, and Jake reciprocated with equal fervor. Minutes passed as they held each other, their embrace filled with promises and unspoken emotions. Chanty's tears fell again, But Jake didn't let go. They eventually lay down together, Jake's arms still securely wrapped around her. "I love you so much," Jake whispered, his gaze tender as he looked into Chanty's eyes. "I can't live without you, my love." Jake kissed her passionately, his lips pouring out all the love he felt for her. But as the kiss deepened, Chanty pulled away. "Jake, can we not, for now? I'm not ready." "Maybe next time," Chanty said, her voice almost breaking. Jake looked at her with understanding. Gently, he cupped her cheek and smiled. "Don't worry. I understand. I won't push you," he said softly. "For now, this is all I can give you," Chanty said as she hugged Jake tightly once more. He returned her embrace with equal intensity, whispering words of love and reassurance. As Jake's embrace grew tighter, Chanty felt the weight of his love and commitment. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but think of Vasper. What was he doing on the island? Was he still there? Would he ever return to the inner world and to Princess Solora? Chanty fought hard to push these thoughts aside. She had chosen Jake, and she wanted to believe they had a future together, even if they couldn't legally marry. "Jake, why can't our marriage be legal here in the outer world?" she asked. "They claim I'm already married and that my wife is still alive, which makes our marriage here invalid," Jake explained, looking into her eyes. "Jake, is that true?" Chanty asked, her voice trembling. "Of course not, silly," Jake replied, laughing softly. "It's not true. I've never been married before. You're the first woman I've ever married, here on Earth or anywhere else. In your 200 years on Earth, you've never fallen in love? Not even once?" Chanty asked, curious. Jake met her gaze, his honesty shining through. "In the past, I've had flings, relationships that were just for fun. You know, as a man, I indulged. But none of it was serious." Chanty felt a pang of jealousy, even though she knew it was all in the past. She gently touched Jake's lips, and he playfully opened his mouth to bite her finger lightly, making her smile. "If I can't claim you legally, how can I ensure you're truly mine?" Chanty asked, her voice tinged with insecurity. Jake smiled. "Don't worry. I've spoken with David about what we need to do. I've decided to leave the inner world permanently. Once I'm no longer a resident there, we'll be able to marry legally here in the outer world after the Twilight Reckoning." Chanty was taken aback. "But Jake, don't you have a lot of properties and wealth in the inner world? Won't you lose everything if you do that?" Jake's smile didn't waver. "What good is all of that if it means I can't have you completely? I'm willing to give it all up for you, my love." Chanty was reminded of Vasper's words, how he too had been willing to give up everything to be with her. She struggled to suppress her thoughts of him. Jake kissed her again, reverently and full of love. "Don't worry. Even if I only have my resources here in the outer world, I'll still be able to give you a life fit for a queen." "You'll never struggle," Jake assured her. Chanty looked away, embarrassed. "That's not what I meant. Isn't your inheritance from your parents? Won't it all go to the Sylvan Concord and King Elander if you give it up?" "I don't like him, he's power-hungry," Chanty said, frowning. Jake's expression turned serious. "In the coming months, you'll see the true state of the inner world and the games played by its rulers. But don't worry about that. Focus on our future, on becoming the mother of my children," Jake said, his tone soft but firm. Chanty blushed deeply, unable to respond. Jake chuckled at her reaction. "The problems of the Sylvan Concord aren't our concern anymore, as long as you're safe," Jake continued. After a moment, he added, "Once your short training is complete, come back here immediately. Don't worry about Alexander Mondragon, he won't be able to harm you. But you can harm him. That's why I'm not worried. Don't hesitate to pierce his left chest with the sword of destiny." Chanty froze at his words. Would she really have to eliminate Vasper's father? If it was her mission, she would do it, for Jake and for herself. "Jake, the Verdant Envoy will pick me up in just a few hours. I wanted to talk to David before I leave," Chanty said. Jake looked at her, his expression serious. "All right, let's go see David," he said without hesitation. "Don't you have anything you want to bring to the inner world?" Jake asked. "I already sent the jogging pants and other things you requested," Jake added with a gentle smile. Chanty smiled. "Thank you. Your t-shirt is what I wear at night as long as I can get it washed," she said with a soft laugh. Jake smiled in return and pulled her into a tight hug. "Do you want me to bring you more of my t-shirts?" he asked in a slow, sultry voice. Chanty grinned. "That one you just took off, the unwashed one," she teased. Chanty walked over to the laundry basket, grabbed Jake's shirt, and tucked it into her backpack. While she packed, Jake simply watched her with an amused smile. "Why the unwashed one?" "It's still sweaty," Jake remarked with a chuckle. Chanty stepped closer to him and said, "So I can always smell your scent. It makes me feel like we're still together in the inner world." Jake hugged her tightly and kissed her passionately, their lips meeting in a fervent embrace. When they finally pulled apart, Chanty stepped away and headed to the bathroom, taking some jackets from her walk-in closet. As she glanced at her reflection in the mirror, she silently thanked herself for wearing a jacket and jogger pants. Otherwise, Jake might have seen the kiss marks Vasper had left on her neck, breasts and thighs. Although she had already confessed everything to Jake, she didn't want him to see the evidence. She adjusted her hair to cover the side of her neck where Vasper's marks were visible. Once Chanty finished packing her things, she approached Jake, who was sitting on the sofa waiting for her. As soon as she was ready, Jake stood up, prepared to escort her to David. "Leave your things here. We'll come back after your talk with David," Jake said softly. Chanty nodded, and Jake embraced her, placing a soft kiss on her lips. When their lips parted, the scenery around them shifted. They were suddenly in David's mansion. "Miss Chanty!" Lorena shouted as she ran toward Chanty, wrapping her arms around her in a joyful hug. Both women laughed, showing how much Lorena had missed Chanty. Jake stepped back to give them space as they reunited. Lorena held Chanty's hands, looking at her face with excitement. "Oh my! I missed you so much!" Lorena exclaimed, tears of joy in her eyes. Chanty laughed warmly. "How are you, Lorena?" "I'm always fine here with Sir David, Miss Chanty," Lorena replied with a smile before turning to Jake. "Sir David is still in his room. He'll come out soon." Jake nodded politely, his expression soft. Lorena turned back to Chanty, her face lighting up. "Miss Chanty, you've become even more beautiful since you went to the inner world. Did you enjoy your time there? You've grown so stunning." Chanty simply smiled. "Thank you, Lorena," she replied warmly. Jake watched the two women, amused by their conversation. "Chanty," came a loud voice from the second floor. It was Justin, laughing as he looked down at them from the stairs. Justin quickly made his way down and approached Chanty, pulling her into a quick hug. "Wow! Look at you! After just 2 months, you're even more beautiful. Did you enjoy the inner world's climate, even without the sun?" Justin teased. Chanty smiled but only gave a modest nod. At that moment, David stepped out of his room on the ground floor, his hair still damp, indicating he had just finished showering. "Chanty!" "I'm sorry, I was in the bathroom when I felt your presence," David said, dressed in a plain white t-shirt and cargo shorts. Chanty laughed and ran toward him, embracing him warmly. To her, David felt like a big brother. "David! I missed you!" Chanty exclaimed. "I missed you too, Chanty. Look at you, you're glowing," David said, smiling at her. Their laughter filled the room as they exchanged greetings, and Jake's demeanor turned serious as he watched David. "David, Chanty can only stay for a few hours. She wants to talk to you, and then we'll head back to the mansion," Jake explained. David glanced at Jake, then at Chanty. "Is that so? I was wondering why you're here, but I won't ask. Come to my office," he said, leading the way. Chanty followed David, looking back briefly at Jake before disappearing into the office. Jake, Lorena, and Justin stayed behind in the living room. "Sir Jake, should I prepare dinner for you?" Lorena asked. Jake shook his head. "No, Lorena, we've already eaten," he replied. Lorena nodded and excused herself, leaving to return to her quarters. Now, only Jake and Justin were left in the living room, seated on the sofa. Jake tried to strain his ears to catch any part of the conversation between Chanty and David, but the office was soundproof. "You won't hear anything no matter how hard you try," Justin said with a laugh. Jake turned to Justin. "Where's Margot?" Justin chuckled, leaning back on the sofa. "He's in Japan. Always there because of Jasmine. I wouldn't be surprised if we hear wedding bells soon." Jake laughed. "Good for him. It's about time he settled down and started a family." "I agree. I'm happy for him," Justin said before looking at Jake with curiosity. "How are Jacob and Leica? I know what you did in the inner world." Jake's expression turned serious. "Did you tell David?" Justin burst out laughing. "Of course not. Where's Jacob now? He hasn't come here lately." Jake smirked. "I don't meddle in Jacob's personal life. As for whether he and Leica are back together, I have no idea." Justin raised an eyebrow, amused. Jacob is our brother. Of course, we care about him. Jacob's an adult. He knows what he's doing," Jake replied. "And besides, Leica is the only one he's been with. Even if they're far apart, it's their personal business now." Justin laughed harder. "Don't forget, you're the reason they got back together. If the Mondragon clan starts hunting them again, it'll be on you." Jake fell silent, his gaze sharp. "They're grown-ups, Justin. They can defend themselves. If they ever need help, we'll be there for them. That's all there is to it." Justin sighed, but his laughter faded into a knowing smile. After a few minutes, David and Chanty emerged from the office. Jake immediately stood to meet Chanty, who now looked calmer. David smiled at Chanty. "See you in 3 days. I'm sure we'll be summoned by then." Chanty nodded, looking between Jake and David. Jake turned to David. "We're heading out now. We won't stay long." Chanty took Jake's hand as they prepared to leave. David and Justin watched as the two vanished in the blink of an eye. David turned to Justin. "I want to gather the other guardians here at the mansion," he said firmly. Justin's expression grew serious as he nodded. "Understood." Meanwhile, when Chanty and Jake returned to the mansion, they got busy packing Shanta's things for her journey to Sylvan Concord. The clothes there were different from what she was used to, and she didn't feel comfortable always wearing dresses. She packed mostly joggers, jeans, polo shirts, and t-shirts. After finishing, 3 large suitcases were neatly lined up against the wall in her room. Jake immediately pulled Chanty into a hug and kissed her. "I'm going to miss you so much," he whispered before their lips met again in a passionate kiss. Jake respected Chanty's wishes to keep their intimacy limited to kisses and hugs for now. However, Chanty could feel Jake's desires, but she knew it wasn't the right time for them to go further, especially since she had just come from Vasper. Jake had promised her they would start fresh, and that's exactly what they were doing, starting from the beginning. Jake sat down on the sofa, with Chanty straddling his lap, their faces mere inches apart. "Jake, in the Twilight Reckoning, I don't want you to come. Wait for me to finish my mission first, okay?" Chanty asked softly. Jake didn't respond immediately. "Is this because of the prophecy?" he finally asked with a faint smile. Chanty nodded. "Believe it or not, just please don't go. Follow my lead, okay? It's enough that David will be there. But you, stay here." Jake chuckled. "Aren't I your husband? I'm supposed to be by your side whenever you need me." "Jake. Please. I can handle this. I'll finish my mission so I can come back here. I just want a simple life. I don't want to stay in the inner world forever," Chanty said earnestly. Jake smiled and caressed her cheek. I love you so much. I'll miss you terribly, he said in a soft whisper. Their lips met again in a kiss full of longing and love, Jake's embrace consuming Chanty with his desire and affection. A soft moan escaped between them as the kiss deepened. It took a few minutes before they pulled away, but Jake's arms remained tightly wrapped around her. His body trembled as he struggled to suppress his urges and the heat coursing through him. He wanted to feel Shanty's skin against his but respected her wishes. Chanty understood Jake's struggles. Thank you for choosing me, Jake whispered. Chanty smiled in response. Does Jacob's spy still remain in Sylvan Concord? Chanty asked. Jake nodded. Don't worry, someone is keeping watch over you there, especially against Vasper Mondragon. But it feels like we're losing because the king himself is now on Vasper's side, Jake said. Chanty nodded as well. That's why I'm going there now. But don't worry. I have a feeling Vasper will keep his word not to bother me again. He brought me back here to you, which means he's sincere in his promise. He won't meddle with us anymore, Chanty explained. Jake simply stared at her. Knowing Vasper's nature, he doubted the sincerity of his words, but seeing that Vasper had returned Chanty to the mansion, he wanted to believe it. Let's hope so, Jake thought. After the twilight reckoning, meet me at my place in the inner world. We'll reunite outside Sylvan Concord, in the kingdom of Iluvathar, Jake said. Chanty smiled and nodded. Can I leave Sylvan Concord freely on my own? She asked. Yes, you can, but they have a law that requires you to have a guard or envoy when outside. You'll be under constant watch, Jake explained. Chanty sighed in frustration. So it's not really freedom, she muttered. Jake chuckled. Don't worry, what's important is that you'll be able to leave. That way, we can see each other there. Laika wouldn't let me use her vehicle because it might be detected by Sylvan Concord and taken from her. My old vehicles were confiscated there because I used them without authorization, Jake added. Chanty's eyes widened. They're that strict. Why? Aren't you one of the guardians? Shouldn't you have those vehicles? Yes, we do, but they don't have teleportation abilities. They're just ordinary ones. That's why I can't visit you in Sylvan Concord. I don't have the authorization to go there, Jake explained. Chanty hugged him tightly. It's okay, even if I have a bodyguard, as long as we get to see each other there. Their lips met again in a kiss filled with desire, longing, and love. Just then, they felt the presence of the Vernon envoy, accompanied by the buzzing sound of their vehicle outside the mansion. Chanty and Jake immediately stood up, startled. Looking at the clock on the wall, Chanty exclaimed, "It's not time yet. It hasn't been 24 hours. Jake was equally surprised, but he held Chanty close. They teleported outside the mansion at the swimming pool. The elven soldiers approached them and, to Chanty's shock, explained in a language she understood that the envoy wasn't only there for her, they were also there to arrest Jake. The reason? A violation of Sylvan Concord's laws, specifically the new decree from the king banning Jake's marriage to Don Lorenzo under their code of conduct. No. Jake, no. What does this mean? You can't do this to him. Please don't. Chanty cried, panicked and desperate. The envoy ignored her pleas and moved closer to Jake, placing a suspended necklace around his neck. Chanty froze, tears streaming down her face as she saw Jake lose his powers. Jake, she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake looked at her calmly. We'll take your suitcases with us to the inner world. Don't worry, I'll face King Elander, he reassured her. Still sobbing, Chanty held on to Jake as he negotiated with the envoy to allow them enough time to prepare. The envoy agreed, and the two went back inside the mansion. Jake quickly wrote a letter and entrusted it to his elven staff, instructing them to deliver it to David immediately. Chanty continued to sob as she meticulously packed Jake's belongings. The two embraced tightly, finding solace in each other's arms. Don't worry, please stop crying, Jake murmured, his voice soothing. David will help, too. They gathered their things and loaded them into the vehicle. As they prepared to leave, both Chanty and Jake paused, gazing back at their mansion while the doors closed behind them. But inside the vehicle, a shocking sight greeted them. Vasper Mondragon lay unconscious on the floor. Chanty and Jake froze in disbelief. Chanty immediately averted her gaze, refusing to look at Vasper. Jake turned to the envoy and asked, "What happened to him?" The envoy replied, "He's completely intoxicated. Princess Solora summoned him, but he overindulged in alcohol." Chanty glanced at Jake with a stern expression. Jake pressed his lips together, looking at Vasper sprawled on the floor, appearing lifeless. His gaze then shifted to Chanty, whose trembling figure betrayed her unease. Jake wrapped his arms around her protectively. Chanty's mind raced. Why now? Why does everything have to happen all at once? Soon, the vehicle teleported, and the surroundings changed abruptly. The darkness of the outer world gave way to the twilight brightness of the inner world. When the doors opened, Chanty and Jake stepped out, only to be immediately surrounded. 2 envoys held Jake firmly, while 4 others flanked Chanty, carrying her belongings. Chanty tried to approach Jake, but the envoys blocked her path. Tears streamed down Chanty's face as she cried out, "Jake! Where can I see you? Where are they taking you?" Jake met her gaze with determination. "Tell your assistant to visit me in my chamber," he instructed. Before Chanty could process his words, another vehicle materialized nearby. The door opened, and Princess Solora stepped out, her face a mask of cold fury. She approached their vehicle, her movements deliberate. Chanty and Jake exchanged a tense look as elven staff members carried Vasper's unconscious body, levitating it effortlessly with telekinesis, and transferred him to Zalora's vehicle. Chanty stood frozen, stunned by the unfolding scene. Jake's eyes never left her, even as he struggled against the envoys holding him back. Zalora, however, paid Jake no attention. Approaching Chanty, Zalora's expression darkened. Without warning, she struck Chanty across the face with a sharp slap. Chanty gasped, clutching her stinging cheek in shock. Jake, witnessing the assault, roared in rage, thrashing violently against his captors. And they disappeared. "Liar!" Zalora hissed. "I know about your relationship with Vasper, Don Lorenzo. You'll both pay for humiliating me in front of the rulers during what was supposed to be my engagement announcement." Chanty, her anger boiling over, shouted back, "There's nothing between me and Vasper, Solora. I just came from my husband's home, Jake's home. Don't try to fool me with your pathetic lies." Zalora spat, her voice dripping with venom. "Save your act, Chanty. I'm not stupid. I know the truth. After the Twilight Reckoning, I can't wait to scar your face with my blade." Her words were cold, each one cutting deeper than the last. Chanty stood in shock, her lips trembling as she stared into Zalora's enraged eyes. Before she could respond, the sound of movement inside Zalora's vehicle caught her attention. Vasper had woken and was now thrashing, his confusion evident. Hearing his voice, Chanty panicked. She turned abruptly and ran toward her chambers, ignoring her envoy guards and leaving Zalora fuming behind her. All Chanty wanted in that moment was to avoid crossing paths with Vasper. But as she fled, a strong hand suddenly gripped her arm, jerking her back. The force spun her around, and she collided with none other than Vasper himself. His grip was unrelenting as he held her by the waist, preventing her escape. "Where do you think you're going?" Vasper's deep voice was laced with bitterness. "What's the rush? Are you scared?" Chanty squirmed, trying desperately to break free. "Let me go, Vasper. Have you forgotten the promises you made? Just let me go," she shouted through gritted teeth. She glanced towards Zalora, who was now glaring at them both, her face a mask of jealousy and rage. Zalora's elven guards stood silently behind her, their stances poised and alert. But Vasper only tightened his hold on Chanty, his eyes locked on hers. "I must have been a fool to agree to your demands," he growled. Chanty's eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" "Yes, you're a fool. A stupid prince," she yelled back, her frustration boiling over. "Yes," Vasper retorted, his tone defiant. "I was dumb and stupid the moment I met you. And now, I'm going to embrace that stupidity fully." Before Chanty could respond, Zalora's furious voice rang out, shouting Vasper's name. Both he and Chanty turned to face her, the anger in her expression nearly tangible. "Do you have any idea what your actions will cost you?" Zalora demanded, her voice shaking with fury. Vasper's gaze didn't waver as he replied calmly, "Yes, I know." Chanty stood frozen, stunned by his response. "I will never forgive you for what you've done to me, Vasper." Zalora screamed. "You humiliated me in front of the rulers, before my own family. You're both liars. You made me believe you didn't know each other while standing right in front of me. You're shameless." Chanty finally broke free from Vasper's grasp, shoving him away with all her strength. "Zalora, take your boyfriend back to your palace." "I don't want him," Chanty snapped, her voice trembling with emotion. "And stop interfering in my life." Her voice rose as she continued, now addressing both Zalora and Vasper. "If you ever cross me again, you'll see what I'm truly capable of." Her words carried a threat, her tone firm and unyielding. Zalora glared at her, fury burning in her eyes, while Vasper stood silent, watching Chanty. Vasper smirked sarcastically. "Zalora, go back to your place." "I have no intention of going with you." "I'll stay here in the Sylvan Concord," he said firmly. Chanty, stunned, stared at Vasper in disbelief, unable to comprehend his stubbornness. Then, turning to her, Vasper declared, "No one tells me what to do. I follow my own will." Chanty, fed up and unwilling to argue further, turned abruptly and ran, leaving Vasper and Zalora to their dispute. Her mind was preoccupied with Jake, longing to reunite with him. She reached her chambers, where Mara waited by the door, offering a polite bow and opening it for her. Without acknowledging Mara, Chanty entered hurriedly. "Mara, I'm heading to the Golden Bath." "I'm not feeling well," she said curtly. Mara nodded and summoned a vehicle. Chanty glanced briefly at her suitcases, neatly placed in the center of the room, before rushing outside. As the vehicle awaited her, she noticed Vasper standing by her door, his stern gaze locked on her, hand resting on the doorknob. Chanty's irritation grew, convinced he was an enemy she could not escape. Believing her ordeal with him was over, she was dismayed to find it persisting. She sat inside the vehicle. On it teleported suddenly, changing the surroundings to the serene dome of the Golden Bath. Wasting no time, Chanty headed to the healing bath, undressed, and immersed herself in the golden liquid. Ignoring the other women present, she plunged into the bath up to her neck, hoping to erase every trace of Vasper's touch. Closing her eyes, she sought solace in the warmth of the liquid. But upon reopening them, there he was, Vasper, standing before her, arms crossed, his stern gaze fixed upon her. Panic welled up in Chanty as she scanned the area, worried Lauren might be nearby. The other women's attention shifted to the pair, fueling her anger. She resolved not to acknowledge Vasper, certain speaking to him would be futile. Once her discomfort subsided, she emerged from the bath, ignoring his piercing gaze on her golden-covered body. She quickly proceeded to rinse off and put on the golden robe provided for her. Outside, Vasper awaited her yet again. Without a word, she boarded the vehicle, hoping to leave him behind. But to her dismay, he joined her, sitting beside her. Chanty sat stiffly, her face a mask of annoyance, refusing to acknowledge his presence. Vasper, however, continued to observe her with unwavering intensity. They arrived at the dome of Chanty's chambers, only to be greeted by an unexpected sight, Princess Zalora and Jake waiting outside. Chanty's face lit up with relief as she saw Jake, but Vasper's mood darkened immediately. He grabbed Chanty's arm, his teeth clenched in frustration. "How did he get in here?" Vasper demanded. Chanty yanked her arm free. "Let me go." "Vasper, from now on, focus on your fiancé and leave me alone with my husband." "I'm so sick of you," she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "Oh, really? After everything that happened between us at the island?" "Fool yourself, but you can't erase me from your life," Vasper retorted, his grip tightening as he pulled her close. Chanty struggled fiercely, pushing him away with all her might before rushing to the door and running to Jake. "Jake!" Chanty cried, tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around him. Jake, serious yet calm, held her close. Zalora, however, glared at Chanty with fury and disdain. "How did you get out?" Chanty asked Jake, her voice shaking. "I was coming to you from the Golden Bath." Jake smiled gently. "Mara told me to meet you here," he replied. "I'll explain everything later." His gaze then shifted to Vasper, who stood behind Chanty. Their eyes locked, sharp and intense, their tension palpable. Both clenched their fists, their anger evident. "Vasper, your father is summoning you," Zalora yelled, approaching with visible rage. She spoke in their native tongue, which only Vasper and Jake understood. Chanty clung tightly to Jake, trembling at the escalating conflict. "Jake, let's go inside," Chanty urged, pulling him toward the door. But as they moved, Vasper roared, "No one goes inside that room." His shout froze Chanty and Jake in their tracks. Jake's body shook with fury as he turned to face Vasper, prepared to confront him. Chanty, trembling with fear, prayed to avoid further chaos. Tears streamed down Zalora's face as she glared at Vasper, her voice breaking with anguish. "Vasper, what's wrong with you? You're not like this. When did you lower yourself this way, over a woman?" she cried, pointing accusingly at Chanty. Jealousy and rage consumed her as she watched Vasper's devotion to Chanty unfold. Chanty tightened her grip on Jake, her fear of the impending fight evident. Glaring at Zalora, she shouted, "Take your boyfriend and leave. I don't want him. Please, stay out of my life. Vasper, go back to your kingdom and leave me in peace with my husband." Her voice, filled with anguish and tears, pleaded desperately. But Vasper stepped closer, his expression cold and resolute. "He's not your husband, Chanty. You're not married," he declared, his teeth clenched. Zalora sobbed into her hands, her body trembling as the weight of her jealousy overwhelmed her. Jake grasped Chanty's arms, praying her away gently but firmly. "No, Jake, please," Chanty begged, looking into his eyes. "Leave us, Vasper. Please." Chanty screamed in panic, but Vasper remained unfazed, his gaze deadly and fixed on Jake. As Jake freed himself from Chanty's embrace, he moved like lightning, launching a punch at Vasper. The two men clashed violently, their blows echoing through the chambers as blood spattered on the floor. Chanty screamed in terror, paralyzed by fear, as statues toppled and the room's decor crumbled under the force of their battle. Even Zalora, usually composed, found herself shaken by the brutal scene, her concern for Vasper evident despite her anger. The fight raged on, both men equally matched in strength and speed, destroying everything in their path. Suddenly, a vehicle arrived, its door opening swiftly as three envoys descended and approached Vasper and Jake. Suspended in midair by the tridents the envoys carried, both men were rendered motionless, bloody and battered. Their bodies bore numerous wounds and bruises, their faces were swollen, with split eyebrows and lips, blood staining their foreheads. Their torn shirts and pants added to their disheveled appearance. Zalora, staring at the envoys, still had a panicked look in her eyes, while Chanty gazed at Jake and Vasper with deep concern. Her frantic eyes darted toward Jake. "Jake!" Chanty cried out in desperation. The envoys loaded the two men into the vehicle, their bodies still floating and stiff, their clenched fists and strained faces showing their struggle. Chanty attempted to follow, but an envoy gestured firmly, forbidding her. Defeated, she stepped back, tears streaming down her face as the vehicle vanished from view. Zalora then turned to Chanty, her expression furious. She trembled with anger and jealousy as she glared at Chanty. "What did you do to him? Why is he like this, Don Lorenzo?" Zalora demanded. Chanty met her gaze, her own filled with sorrow. "Nothing, Zalora. I beg you, bind him, keep him by your side so he won't leave. Please, so I can have peace of mind." Her voice was soft, almost pleading. Without waiting for a response, Chanty turned and walked to her room, leaving Zalora standing there, shaking with rage. Inside her room, Chanty closed the door and let her emotions pour out. Collapsing onto the bed, she sobbed uncontrollably, gripping the sheets as waves of despair overtook her. She didn't know what to do. Grabbing her communication device, she called Mara, her assistant. Chanty asked Mara to find out where Jake and Vasper had been taken. Mara quickly acknowledged her request and assured Chanty she'd look into it. Hours passed with no word, and eventually, Chanty cried herself to sleep on the bed. When she woke up, she bolted upright, glancing at the clock. Panic washed over her. She had slept for too long, exhaustion and stress taking their toll. Scrambling to her suitcases, she picked out jeans and a polo shirt, readying herself to leave. But Mara hadn't returned yet, so Chanty called her again. Minutes later, Mara arrived, but she wasn't alone. She brought a team of stylists with her, much to Chanty's confusion. Mara smiled and bowed slightly. "Miss Chanty, they're here to prepare you for the dinner of the Round Table," she explained. Chanty blinked. "What's the dinner of the Round Table, Mara?" "It's part of the Twilight Reckoning, Miss Chanty," Mara said patiently. "It's where your fate will be decided after the Twilight Reckoning, whether Alexander Mondragon wins or not." Chanty still didn't understand. "Why does there need to be a dinner? Why wasn't I told about this in advance so I could prepare?" Mara offered a reassuring smile. "The Guardians will be there, Miss Chanty, along with the King's chosen guests." Excitement flickered in Chanty's voice. "David will be there? Are you sure?" Mara nodded, smiling. Chanty felt a moment of relief, but her mind quickly shifted. Why hadn't David told her about such an important dinner? And could Jake also be present? "Mara, have you found out what I asked about?" Chanty asked again. Mara's expression grew serious. "Miss Chanty, there's been no word on where they were taken. Everything is silent." "I'm sorry." Chanty's heart sank. She could only hope she'd see Jake at the dinner. Over an hour passed, and the stylists finished their work. Chanty now wore a delicate, thin-strapped dress that hugged her figure, with a high slit on the left side and a plunging neckline that showcased her beauty. The gown was nude-colored, enhancing her allure, as if she were a goddess of beauty and temptation. Her hair was styled to cascade over her left shoulder, leaving her right side exposed. Blue sapphire and diamond jewelry adorned her, completing the look. She could hardly believe how she looked, like she was going to a romantic dinner. Even Mara was stunned, staring at her. "Miss Chanty, your beauty is like that of a goddess," Mara said, her voice awestruck. "You're a goddess of beauty, Miss Chanty. I'm so proud of you." Chanty glanced at her reflection in the mirror, equally surprised by the transformation. Yet her thoughts were still on Jake. Would she see him tonight? The worry in her eyes was unmistakable, her emotions raw and visible. As the stylists packed up their tools and left, Chanty's vehicle arrived. She sat inside, her nerves frayed, while Mara, seated beside her, smiled encouragingly. Chanty, however, couldn't smile back. Her mind was consumed by Jake and Vasper. One she desperately wanted to forget, and the other she longed to be with forever. The scenery outside changed as they arrived at a grand hall. When the vehicle doors opened, Chanty's jaw dropped. Enormous columns, intricately designed statues, and a towering ceiling painted with what appeared to be a live depiction of the solar system greeted her. The paintings seemed to move, as though alive. Mara guided her through the hall, their steps echoing against the polished black glass floor. Chanty took in the magnificent surroundings, marveling at the beauty of the architecture. At the end of the hall was an enormous black door, polished to perfection. 2 envoys stood guard outside. Upon seeing them approach, the envoys opened the doors, bowing slightly. Mara stopped, bowing as well, and remained outside as Chanty walked in. She hesitated, looking back at Mara, but continued forward. Inside, she saw a large round table with familiar faces seated around it, including David and the 5 guardians. Jake was among them, his regal attire making him look like a prince. Chanty smiled at him, her excitement evident. But as she glanced around, she noticed the stern expressions on everyone's faces. Jake's eyes, however, were focused solely on her, filled with admiration. Then, her gaze landed on Vasper Mondragon, seated beside the king. Both Jake and Vasper were now free of any wounds or bruises, their handsome, commanding presence fully restored. Everyone at the table, including the king, rose in unison. She realized she was the only woman in the room. An elven attendant approached and guided her to a vacant seat, but it wasn't near Jake. Instead, it was right beside Vasper Mondragon. Chanty looked at Jake with worried, pleading eyes, as if silently begging him. Jake, too, was clearly holding back his emotions. The other guardians glanced at Chanty meaningfully. David, serious as ever, stood among them, along with Jacob, Justin, Marco, Gabriel, and Louis. When they reached the king's side, Chanty bowed respectfully, and the king smiled faintly. Vasper, meanwhile, was watching Chanty intently, his gaze fixed on her. He reached for her hand resting on her staff, but Chanty pulled away and went straight to her seat. Her eyes never left Jake. The tension in the room felt like a volcano on the brink of eruption. Chanty sat far from Jake, seated directly across from him. Their gazes never wavered, an unspoken conversation passing between them. Jake didn't care about the piercing glare Vasper directed at him. Once the king took his seat, everyone else followed suit. Chanty was relieved that her chair was a bit distanced from Vasper's, but even the space between them couldn't quell the tension she felt radiating from him. She could still sense his presence keenly. The guardians watched Chanty as the king raised his right hand, gesturing with authority. Still, Chanty and Jake's eyes remained locked. Chanty's heart yearned to run to Jake and embrace him, but she stayed frozen in her place. She didn't notice the stormy expression on Vasper's face, though the guardians did, their attention shifting toward him. At that moment, the staff entered in a line, carrying trays of food. They moved systematically, setting the dishes on the table. Vasper seized the opportunity to move his chair closer to Chanty. The guardians noticed, as did Jake, but the king seemed unbothered by Vasper's gesture. Chanty's heart pounded harder as Vasper drew closer. She could feel the heat from his body, or perhaps it was just the tension she felt whenever he was near. Jake's sharp, deadly gaze shifted from Chanty to Vasper, who ignored it entirely. Jacob, sitting next to Jake, adjusted his collar, his eyes narrowing at Vasper. But Vasper paid no attention to anyone else, his focus solely on Chanty. The food was now laid out, and the staff began pouring wine into their glasses. The king raised his glass in a toast, prompting everyone to follow suit. Almost in unison, they all sipped a small amount of wine. The king then gestured for them to start eating. Vasper took it upon himself to serve Chanty, offering her various dishes, including some rare delicacies from the outer world. "Vasper, I can serve myself," Chanty said softly but firmly. Vasper smiled, feeling a small triumph. Her attention, however brief, was on him. But when Chanty glanced back at Jake, his serious expression and barely concealed anger toward Vasper were unmistakable. Chanty smiled faintly at Jake, lifting her left hand with her wine glass to subtly show off their wedding ring. Jake mirrored her actions, raising his wine glass with a faint smile directed only at her, and they toasted silently through the air. Both sipped their wine, their eyes locked on each other, ignoring the rest of the room. Vasper's expression darkened with barely contained rage. Jacob and David silently observed Vasper, their expressions cautious and calculating. The king, meanwhile, remained indifferent to the tension around the table, the clinking of silverware on plates the only sound breaking the silence. Vasper placed his hand on top of Chanty's on the table, but Chanty quickly pulled her hand away, glaring at him sharply. The guardian's attention turned to the two of them. Jake clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around his fork and knife so hard it seemed they might snap. Vasper met Jake's glare with a challenging look as he calmly took a bite of his steak. Jacob, seated beside Jake, suddenly stood and approached Chanty, bowing slightly. "Chanty, may I switch seats with you?" Jacob asked politely. Vasper abruptly stood, facing Jacob with a cold, menacing stare. David was immediately on alert, his eyes darting to the king, who was now watching Vasper and Jacob intently. Chanty rose in alarm, but Vasper grabbed her hand and forcefully pulled her back into her seat. She gasped audibly, her breath hitching in fear. "Return to your seat, Jacob," Vasper commanded, his tone sharp and authoritative. Their gazes clashed, each filled with tension. David's commanding voice broke the standoff. "Jacob," he called firmly, and Jacob reluctantly returned to his chair. The king finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy with authority. "I want to announce to everyone here that after the twilight reckoning, regardless of victory or defeat, Don Lorenzo will belong to Vasper Mondragon. This decree is final, and I expect all of you to respect it." His words felt like a punch to Shanty's chest. She struggled to breathe, trembling as she turned to look at Jake, helpless and shattered. Her body shook as tears began to stream down her face, though she didn't notice. Jake, equally helpless, watched her silently, his pain reflected in his eyes. "Your Majesty," Shanty said, standing with newfound courage, "I will not agree to be with Vasper Mondragon after the twilight reckoning." Her voice was firm as she faced the king. Vasper also rose, his expression a mix of hurt and determination as he watched her. "If you refuse," the king said, his voice icy, "then the sentence will fall on Jake Valerian. He will be confined to the dragon's chambers for 10 years as punishment for his transgressions and violations of the code of conduct." Shanta's eyes widened in shock, her gaze snapping to Jake. He was already standing, staring back at her with a resolute expression. "Shanty, make wise decisions in your life," the king continued, his tone laced with threat. "Do not end up like the mothers of these guardians, who made the wrong choices and met early deaths because of it." The room fell silent, the guardians' lips pressed into tight lines as they exchanged uneasy glances between the king, Chanty, and Vasper. Shanta sank back into her chair, trembling as she reached for her water glass. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it. Her gaze returned to Jake, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. She had completely lost her appetite. Vasper, seated beside her, reached under the table to hold her trembling hand. Shanty shot him a glare, pulling her hand away. Undeterred, Vasper moved his hand to her exposed thigh, the high slit of her dress making her skin accessible. Shanta's anger burned beneath the surface, but she hid it well. Her sharp gaze locked onto Vasper's, their eyes clashing like swords in a silent battle. The king's voice broke through the tension, heavy and commanding. "Since Vasper Mondragon has rejected the marriage alliance with the kingdom of Azaya and instead stands firm on his intention to marry Don Lorenzo to make her his queen, the time has come to unite the kingdom of Sylvan Concord with Velantis Noctem," the king declared, his tone final as his gaze swept over the room. Jake's eyes filled with despair, his hopelessness etched deep into his features. Shanta's chest tightened as she witnessed his silent anguish. The king continued, "The welfare of many outweighs the happiness of the few. May this principle guide your service. Above all, let the code of conduct be upheld, David. Ensure strict enforcement among your subordinates. The next time someone violates it, I demand harsher punishments, if possible, death, so that no one dares break it again." The weight of the king's words made Shanta's heart race, fear twisting in her stomach. Vasper's steady gaze shifted to Jake, and their eyes met in a silent, intense challenge. David rose from his seat, bowed to the king, and said, "It will be done, your Majesty." Shanty turned to David, pity filling her heart. He should have been the prince of this kingdom, or better yet, its king, not Elander Valener, she thought bitterly. King Elander stood, clasping Vasper Mondragon's hand in a symbolic gesture. "The time has come for our kingdoms to unite," he announced. David and the other guardians stood and bowed to the king, raising their hands in allegiance to Vasper. Only Jake and Chanty remained seated, their defiance clear. The king's gaze lingered, silent and expectant. It wasn't until Jacob gave Jake a firm nudge on the shoulder that Jake reluctantly rose. Chanty, tears brimming in her eyes, exchanged a look of shared suffering with Jake. Vasper, seizing the moment, lifted Chanty effortlessly, guiding her to her feet with his hand on her waist. Shanta's defiance faltered, she followed his lead despite her internal protest. Jake also rose, his movements stiff with restrained anger. The dinner ended steeped in tension, the room heavy with suppressed emotions. The clinking of silverware and the scrape of chairs punctuated the charged silence. The king exited first, motioning for David and the guardians, including Jake, to follow. Chanty walked beside Vasper, her gaze fixed on Jake's retreating figure, silently willing him to look back. Desperation fueled her steps as she quickened her pace to close the distance, but Vasper's grip tightened around her waist, halting her. "My queen, behave," Vasper murmured, his voice low but audible enough for Jake to hear. Chanty looked helplessly at Jake, who slowed his stride but didn't turn until it was too late. Vasper had steered Chanty down a separate corridor, leading her toward their designated vehicle. Chanty's high heels slowed her pace, but Vasper, unbothered, scooped her into his arms and carried her the rest of the way. She didn't resist, her protests had proven futile, and Vasper never listened. Once inside the vehicle, Chanty attempted to slide off Vasper's lap, but he held her firmly in place. The vehicle teleported to her chambers within the Grand Dome. As they arrived, Chanty was startled to see a line of envoys standing guard outside her quarters. Confusion mingled with frustration as Vasper reached for her again, intending to carry her, but she pushed him away. "I can walk, Vasper," she said coldly, shrugging off his hand and stepping out of the vehicle on her own. She made her way to her room, but Vasper was quick to follow, slipping inside before the door could close. The moment the door shut, Chanty whirled on him, her fury unleashed. She pounded her fists against his chest. "Who do you think you are to manipulate my life, Vasper? I will not marry you," she shouted, her voice raw with emotion. Vasper stood still, allowing her to vent her frustrations, her fists striking his chest like waves against an unyielding cliff. Slowly, her strength waned, her arms falling limp at her sides. Breathing heavily, Chanty removed her sandals and leaned them against the wall. With slow, weary steps, she moved toward the bed, collapsing onto it in a heap of tears. "Jake. We were supposed to start over," she sobbed into the pillow, her voice muffled but filled with heartbreak. Vasper watched her silently, his jaw clenched. Pain flickered in his eyes as he observed her anguish, but he forced himself to remain resolute. This was necessary, for her safety, for her future. He removed his royal golden robe and sat on the edge of the bed. His gaze lingered on Chanty's trembling form, draped across the mattress. Despite his conflicted emotions, his eyes traced her figure, the curve of her body stirring both longing and sorrow within him. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus on the greater purpose behind his actions. Vasper slowly sat on the edge of the bed, facing Chanty, who was curled up and crying. He was deeply pained, knowing he was the cause of her suffering, yet he felt he had no choice but to force her to follow his wishes for her own good. Chanty was innocent to the political schemes of the inner world. She had no idea of the dangerous games played by the rulers. If Chanty refused to play along, she would inevitably be exploited for her abilities and then systematically eliminated, just as her mother had been, just as the mothers of the other guardians had been. In the past, Vasper had cared little for the rulers' games. His life had revolved around his own pursuits, himself, women, sports, and challenges that tested the limits of his power, strength, and abilities. He had been indifferent to the corrupt kings and power-hungry rulers of both the inner earth and outer world. What interested him more were the women near those rulers, their wives and mistresses. For him, it was a challenge to see if he could capture their attention and draw them away from their men. His life had been an endless adventure, full of pleasure and excitement. But now, his world had been turned upside down. Chanty had entered his life, and everything had changed. His existence revolved around her, the woman now before him, crying. She was the only thing that mattered, her future, her happiness. Yet, he was also the source of her pain, a result of his momentary weakness to temptation, a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. He stared at Chanty's trembling form, a temptation so powerful it nearly broke his resolve. But he refused to make another mistake. Chanty's sobs gradually quieted until she fell silent, but she remained still, unmoving, her face buried as if trying to shut him out. Vasper waited, watching her head, hoping for her to lift it, but she didn't stir for several minutes. Cautiously, Vasper raised his hand to gently smooth her hair, but the moment his fingers brushed it, Chanty whipped around to face him. Her swollen, tear-streaked face was flushed, her eyes blazing with anger, making her beauty even more striking. Her lips, swollen from crying, looked irresistibly kissable, almost inviting. Strands of her disheveled hair clung to her damp cheeks. Her glare was sharp, and to Vasper, she looked even more alluring, if it were up to him, he'd have kissed and embraced her on the spot. But he held himself back. Their gazes locked, his full of love, longing, and desire, hers full of fury and pain. "I'm going to Jake," Chanty suddenly yelled, her voice sharp and trembling. She moved to get off the bed, but Vasper, quick and alert, grabbed her waist and pulled her back. Chanty landed on the soft mattress again, her body bouncing slightly. She struggled to rise, but Vasper pinned her down, holding both her wrists above her head. She kicked her legs wildly, but Vasper simply positioned himself between them, rendering her unable to move. Panting heavily, Chanty glared at him with defiance. Vasper stared back, his gaze stern, his lips pressed tightly together. His eyes, however, betrayed the intensity of his emotions, drifting lower to her chest. There, the string that had held her gown together had snapped, leaving her lace bra exposed. Chanty noticed his gaze and followed it, her eyes widening in horror before snapping back to his face. "Pervert," she screamed. Vasper's expression shifted, his stern demeanor replaced with amusement. Then, he laughed, a deep, maddening laugh that made Chanty's cheeks burn with both anger and embarrassment. She glared at him, furious and mortified, unable to understand what he found so amusing. Vasper's laughter was genuine, his perfect teeth on full display, his eyes gleaming with joy as he looked at her. In that moment, he appeared even more handsome, exuding a charm so captivating it left Chanty momentarily spellbound. She hated herself for noticing, for being drawn to him despite knowing he was the source of her pain. "What's so funny?" Chanty snapped, her voice trembling with rage and humiliation. Her face was now bright red, her anger only fueling her blush. Vasper's laughter stopped abruptly, his expression growing serious. His gaze softened, becoming tender yet charged with temptation. His eyes held a mix of longing and restraint that made Chanty's heart race against her will. She felt a pressure in her chest, an overwhelming sensation she didn't want to acknowledge. Turning her head away, she focused on the wall, avoiding his gaze. She tugged at her wrists, but his grip remained firm. And then she felt it, a hardness pressing against her thigh, Vasper's arousal, faint but unmistakable through his pants. Her body stiffened, her pulse quickening as panic set in. The tension between them thickened, leaving her breathless. "Sorry if I laughed," Vasper began, his deep, resonant voice stirring even more chaos within her. "I just couldn't help it, because of what happened between us on the island? You called me pervert. Just because I looked at this?" His words struck her like a bolt, and before Chanty could react, Vasper's lips descended onto her breast. The soft, searing warmth of his lips brushing against her skin sent an electrifying jolt through her entire body. Chanty froze, her mind racing. His touch was calculated, deliberate, and unbearably tempting. If she allowed this to continue, she wouldn't know how to face Jake afterward. The thought of Jake filled her with a surge of determination. She couldn't fall into temptation again. She wouldn't survive the shame. The weight of what had happened between her and Vasper was already unbearable. Another mistake like this, and she would have no face to show Jake. Driven by an inner resolve, Chanty mustered every ounce of strength within her. She pushed forward, her heart pounding as she tried to break free. Her body trembled with the effort, but Vasper's hold was firm, his intentions unrelenting. "Let me go," Chanty screamed inwardly, but before she could voice the words, Vasper's lips claimed hers in a crushing, passionate kiss. His weight pressed her into the bed, smothering her struggles as his mouth dominated hers. She tried to cry out, to push him away, but her protests were swallowed by his devouring kiss. Her lips parted to protest, but that only allowed his tongue to slip inside, exploring her mouth with a hunger that made her gasp. Chanty's mind screamed for her to resist, but her body betrayed her, reacting to him in ways she desperately wished it wouldn't. Vasper's hand, firm yet teasing, found its way to her thigh. His fingers began their slow, torturous journey upward, tracing her skin from her knee toward her inner thigh. Each touch ignited a fire that threatened to consume her entirely. Chanty's breath hitched. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, the betrayal of her body leaving her feeling utterly powerless. "Stop," she wanted to scream, but her voice faltered. Instead, she gasped audibly as Vasper's hand brushed against the fabric of her underwear, his fingers dancing along its edges with maddening precision. Her breathing turned ragged, her body quivering under his relentless touch. When Vasper finally broke the kiss, Chanty's lips parted, gasping for air, but her reprieve was short-lived. His lips moved to her neck, warm and demanding, leaving a trail of heat as his tongue tasted every inch of her skin. Chanty shuddered, a soft, involuntary moan escaping her lips despite her desperate attempts to suppress it. Her eyes fluttered shut, and her mind grew hazy, overtaken by the intoxicating sensations coursing through her. She wanted to fight, to resist, but her strength was slipping away with every passing moment. Vasper's voice was husky, laden with raw emotion, as he whispered against her lips, "I love you so much." The words struck her deeply, igniting a whirlwind of emotions within her. Chanty wanted to scream at him, to remind him of the chaos he'd caused in her life, but her words wouldn't come. Her body trembled beneath him, overwhelmed by the intensity of his presence. As his hand grew bolder, exploring the boundaries of her resistance, Chanty's breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps. The sound of their ragged breathing filled the room, mingling with Vasper's groans and her soft, helpless moans. Chanty's thoughts blurred, and her struggles weakened. She felt as though she was sinking into quicksand, the pull of temptation dragging her deeper despite her efforts to fight it. Her body betrayed her completely, succumbing to the overwhelming sensations Vasper stirred within her. The scene unfolds with Chanty's hips moving instinctively against Vasper's touch, her body betraying her as his lips trail down to her breasts, which are still concealed by the lace of her bra. Vasper releases Chanty's hands, his touch now more deliberate as one hand slides behind her to unclasp the bra. As soon as the clasp gives way, Vasper devours her breasts with an almost ravenous hunger. His tongue teases one while his hand needs the other, his actions precise and overwhelming. Chanty's moans grow louder, deeper, each sound like music to Vasper's ears. Chanty's hands grip Vasper's hair tightly as he alternates between her breasts, worshipping them with an intensity that makes her gasp. Meanwhile, Vasper's other hand ventures beneath her underwear, his fingers exploring and teasing her sensitive skin. The dampness he finds only spurs him on. Chanty's breath comes in quick, shallow pants as her body responds uncontrollably to his touch. Their eyes meet, both intoxicated, both panting, lost in the heat of the moment. "I love you so much," Vasper whispers, his gaze locking onto hers as his fingers move in a torturous rhythm. Chanty's lips part, and soft moans escape her mouth, her voice betraying the pleasure she's trying to suppress. "Yes, that's it, that's what I want," Vasper says in a husky tone, his voice thick with desire. "Do you want this? Like this?" he asks, his question punctuated by the rhythmic movements of his fingers. Chanty doesn't answer with words, her only response is a moan as her hands clutch the bedsheets beneath her. Vasper's grin deepens, spurred on by her reactions. "Like this?" he asks again, his movements becoming even more deliberate. Chanty arches her back, overwhelmed by the sensations, and Vasper bites his lower lip as he watches her every expression. "My God, you're so beautiful, my queen," he murmurs. Unable to resist any longer, he captures her lips in a fervent kiss, their mouths colliding with unrestrained passion. Their lips and tongues move together in a desperate dance, their breaths mingling as they devour each other. Vasper's hands move quickly, sliding Chanty's underwear off her hips without breaking the kiss. Chanty's hands tremble as she fumbles with the buttons of Vasper's pants, but just as she begins to undo them, Vasper stops her hands. "Don't," he says, his voice trembling with the effort of restraint. "Not now. If you do, I won't be able to hold back. You're such a temptation, too much for me right now." His voice is rough, filled with longing and desire, his body visibly shaking from the intensity of his feelings. But Chanty ignores his plea, her fingers continuing to work on his pants. Vasper groans deeply as her hand slips inside his briefs, her touch finding him hard and ready. His groans grow louder, and he whispers hoarsely, "I swear, Chanty, I can't hold back any longer." Fearing he might lose control entirely, Vasper breaks the kiss abruptly. He moves down, positioning himself between her thighs, his head lowering with purpose. He begins to devour her hungrily, his lips and tongue pouring all his pent-up desire, longing, and love into every movement. Chanty moans deeply, her hands clutching at Vasper's hair as his mouth works its magic. His hands roam her thighs, massaging and squeezing gently before his lips move to kiss and worship her skin. He alternates between her thighs and her center, teasing and satisfying, while one hand finds its way back to her breast, massaging it reverently. Chanty's fingers tighten in his hair, her hips lifting instinctively to meet his mouth. Her breaths become ragged, each exhale punctuated by soft moans as she chases the crescendo building within her. Seconds tick by as she edges closer and closer to release, her movements growing desperate. Vasper senses her nearing the peak and intensifies his efforts, his tongue moving faster, more purposefully. His hand steadies her breast, kneading firmly as he focuses on bringing her over the edge. With a sharp cry, Chanty finally lets go, her hips lifting against Vasper's mouth as she shatters under the waves of pleasure. Her body trembles, her lips part in a soundless gasp, and her eyes shut tightly as she rides out her high. Vasper doesn't stop immediately, his tongue slows, prolonging the sensations and drawing out her pleasure. He steadies her with his hands, keeping her grounded as her body trembles with the aftershocks. As Chanty comes down from her high, her breathing is ragged and heavy. Her chest rises and falls rapidly, the exhaustion from the intensity of the moment leaving her drained. She lies there panting, her body spent, her mind spinning. And Vasper found his release within his pants, a moment of vulnerability that didn't diminish the intensity of his actions. He trailed his tongue over Chanty's sensitive skin, ensuring it was dry, and then looked at her. Chanty had recovered her breath, her beauty once again captivating him. She lay before him, legs parted, fully exposed to his admiring eyes. The sight overwhelmed him, this was the vision he wanted to see for the rest of his life. Vasper moved upward, kissing her navel, then her stomach, up to her breasts, and finally her lips. They kissed again, this time deeply and passionately, as Vasper whispered his endless declarations of love, saying, "I love you so much, my queen." Chanty noticed the dampness of Vasper's pants pressing against her, and their eyes met. "It's better that it came out there than somewhere else," Vasper said in his deep voice. "Trust me, earlier. I didn't have the strength to hold back my feelings because I've missed you so much. After what happened between us on the island, it's been on my mind constantly," he added, his tone sincere. Chanty didn't respond, her mind heavy with thoughts. She felt like she had lost herself in another world, grappling with the weight of what had transpired. How could she ever face Jake again? Breaking the silence, Vasper kissed Chanty passionately once more. Soon, their kisses reignited the heat between them. Again and again, 3 times in total, Vasper brought Chanty to peaks of pleasure, ensuring her joy while keeping her purity intact. By the end of it, Chanty was utterly exhausted, falling into a deep and peaceful sleep, drained from the emotions and sensations Vasper had stirred within her. Vasper, however, was still wide awake, his energy seemingly boundless. His heart overflowed with happiness as he lay beside her, who rested her head on his arm. She lay on her back, completely bare, her serene expression captivating him. He couldn't help but admire her body and face, of her striking beauty, marveling at her peaceful, deep sleep, a sign of how tired she truly was. A smile graced Vasper's lips as he gazed at Chanty, his hand gently brushing her hair. He traced the outline of her lips with his thumb, the softness of her skin irresistible. Unable to restrain himself, he leaned down and pressed a long kiss to her lips, though she didn't wake. "I love you so much, my queen. I won't let you go again, no matter what," he whispered against her lips. He kissed her again and again, unable to stop himself, before finally pulling away to return to watching her. His gaze wandered to her chest, observing the rise and fall of her breathing. His eyes lingered on her breasts, his hand resting gently on one, the warmth of her skin radiating against his palm and tempting him further. But he restrained himself, not wanting to wake her. Instead, Vasper pulled Chanty close, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her head toward his chest. He covered them both with a blanket, and to his surprise, Chanty instinctively wrapped her arm around him in return. Vasper was stunned by the simple gesture. The happiness it brought him was immense, as though he had been lifted to the heavens. In the quiet of the room, he silently prayed for the chance to win back Chanty's love entirely, that she would see no one else in her heart but him. He hugged her tighter, both to keep her warm in the cold room and to savor the connection between them. The warmth of her body sent electricity through his, but he held himself back. He wanted Chanty to regain her strength so he could bring her joy again once she awoke. A contented smile remained on Vasper's lips as he finally closed his eyes, his heart full of hope and happiness, drifting off to sleep beside her. When Chanty opened her eyes, she found herself staring blankly at the ceiling, lost in thought about what had happened between her and Vasper. She felt drained and utterly devoid of energy that day, lacking even the will to get out of bed. As she looked around the room, Vasper was nowhere to be seen. Had he left her? The thought stung, and though she felt a pang of bitterness, she forced herself to rise. She didn't understand the emotions stirring within her. It was as if her world had turned black and white, void of life. She no longer had the courage to face Jake. After everything, was her life with Jake truly over? Because of the king's orders and her own helplessness? She couldn't bear the thought of imprisoning Jake in the chamber with the dragons. She was nothing more than a pawn for the king's plans. "Mother, why did you place me in this situation?" Chanty murmured, tears streaming down her face as she cried silently. Time passed. She had taken a bath, dressed, and was now waiting for her schedule for the day, as provided by Mara. Only one more day remained before the twilight reckoning, the confrontation with Alexander Mondragon. Could she really kill? Despite all her training, fighting against practice dummies was a far cry from driving her blade into a real, living person. She wondered, if she survived her mission, could she finally return to the outer world? All she yearned for was a normal life. But what would await her upon her return? "Jake, I'm sorry," she whispered to herself as she stood before the mirror. Her gaze fell upon the faint kiss mark on her neck, and she quickly covered it with her hair. Despite herself, her thoughts drifted back to Vasper. Where had he gone? Just then, the door to her room creaked open, startling her. Vasper Mondragon stepped inside, and their eyes immediately met. He smiled warmly at her. "My beautiful queen, good morning," he greeted as he walked toward her, his smile unwavering. He pulled her into a tight embrace and kissed her lips passionately. Chanty didn't resist. What was the point anymore? After everything, she was too tired to fight. She simply let herself go with the flow of the life she now lived. Resisting Vasper was futile, the king's will would always prevail. Vasper studied her expression, as if trying to read her thoughts. "Were you looking for me?" "The king summoned me to his residence. We discussed some important matters about what's to come," he said casually. He turned toward the mirror, gazing at their reflection together. A soft smile spread across his face. "I'm sure our children will be as beautiful as you and as handsome as me," he said, his tone playful yet affectionate. Chanty blushed at his words, rolling her eyes in response. Her reaction didn't escape Vasper's notice, and he chuckled. "Why? Isn't it true? I can't wait for us to have children," he teased. Unable to hold it in any longer, Chanty snapped. "Vasper, you already have a child with Samara. What more could you possibly want?" Her voice was sharp, her expression bitter. Vasper's face fell at her words, the hurt evident in his eyes. He moved closer, attempting to reach out for her, but she pushed him away. The thought of Samara lingered in her mind, dampening whatever emotions she might have felt. Vasper's pain deepened as he spoke, his voice soft and pleading. "Please, let's not bring up people who are no longer part of my life. Samara and I are over. That's why I'm here with you. We ended things completely." He paused, his gaze steady as he continued. "And as for the child, I've given Samara everything they need. There's nothing left between us." But Chanty's tears only fell harder. "I hate you. I hate myself. I hate this world," she shouted, grabbing a pillow from the bed and hurling it at him. "Why did I ever meet you? Why couldn't it have been Jake that I loved first? Why does it have to be you?" Her voice cracked as she screamed. Vasper stood frozen, his heart breaking with every word. Slowly, he stepped closer to her, his emotions raw and visible. I hate myself. Why am I still in love with you? Why do I feel jealous of your other women, Vasper? Why can't you just disappear from my life? Why is it you that I love and not Jake? Chanty cried, pounding her fists weakly against his chest. Her sobs racked her body as she continued. I regret every decision I've ever made with you. I wanted to be with Jake, not you. Vasper's tears began to fall as well, silent but steady, as he stood before her like a statue. Chanty, too, became quiet, wiping her tears as she looked at him. The room was chaotic, with pillows and blankets strewn across the floor. Finally, Vasper broke the silence, his voice calm yet resolute. If you play along with the king's game, Chanty, you can be with Jake again. You both can be happy. Chanty stared at him, stunned by his words. Jake has been summoned by King Elander, along with David. You'll be next. You'll face Jake in front of the king, Vasper explained. If you follow the king's orders, your suffering will end, and you can have the life you want with Jake. I've done everything for your future. The choice is yours. Chanty's confusion deepened. I don't understand what you're saying, Vasper. Can you just speak clearly? She asked, irritation flashing in her voice. I don't trust you anymore. You've broken your promises too many times. You're all words, she accused, her frustration palpable. Vasper gave her a faint, bittersweet smile. This time is different. Everything is in your control now, he replied. In a short while, the king will summon you, he continued. You'll discuss how to eliminate me after our wedding and declare yourself Queen of Velantis. Chanty's eyes widened in disbelief. Impossible. Stop making up stories, Vasper. But Vasper smiled once more, undeterred. Whether you believe me or not, you'll see soon enough. Just listen to the king and agree. Don't argue, it'll ensure the safety of both you and Jake. If I'm gone, Jake is the only man I trust to protect you, Vasper said, his voice breaking slightly. Chanty's chest tightened at his words. What? She asked, confused. Isn't it Jake you want to be with? Vasper asked. Follow the king's orders, and your wishes will come true. He reached for her hand, holding it gently as he spoke. You're still so young. There are so many adventures waiting for you. After hearing what you said earlier, I realized just how selfish I've been, he admitted. He stroked her hand softly and kissed it, his touch lingering. You'll understand someday why I've done all this, for you, he whispered. Chanty couldn't decide whether to believe Vasper or not. His words felt like knives piercing her chest, leaving her heart in anguish. The weight of his revelations was suffocating, and just as she struggled to gather her thoughts, her device chimed. Mara was calling. Miss Chanty, King Elander wishes to speak with you, Mara announced. Chanty froze, her gaze darting toward Vasper. He stood there, smiling faintly, his eyes locked on hers. All right, Mara. Thank you, Chanty replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. She hung up, her eyes still fixed on Vasper. Don't let on that you know what the meeting is about, Vasper said softly, his tone tinged with caution. He bent down and began picking up the scattered pillows and blankets Chanty had thrown at him earlier, placing them neatly back on the bed. Chanty watched him, worry etched across her face. What if he was telling the truth? What if everything he'd said was real? What would she do? I'm not sure if I can play this game, she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The possibility of Vasper's claims being true sent shivers through her. Vasper straightened and looked at her, his eyes scanning her face as if reading her thoughts. Then, with deliberate steps, he approached her. He wrapped her in a tight embrace, holding her close for a long moment. Chanty's tears began to flow once more, soaking into his shirt. Yes, you can, Vasper whispered, his voice firm yet soothing. You have the power to make this happen. Only you can defeat Alexander. You are the opponent he's been waiting for. Chanty looked up into his eyes, searching for answers in their depths. It would bring me peace to meet my end at your hands, Vasper murmured, his voice barely audible. "If my death means your happiness, then that alone is a great achievement for me, my queen." He gently squeezed her hand, his words hanging heavily in the air. Shanta's sobs grew louder as she cried out, "What are you talking about? Do you really think I'd do that to you?" Vasper fell silent for a moment before answering, "Then Jake and the rest of the guardians will." Chanty felt her knees weaken at his words. "When that time comes, I won't resist," Vasper continued, his tone calm yet filled with resignation. "Don't worry, you'll finally be free. You and Jake can live happily together. He'll become the king of Velantis, and you'll be his queen. No one will hunt you anymore. The Mondragons will handle Leica, and the Sylvan Concord won't attempt to eliminate you. You'll have fulfilled their ultimate plan." Shanta's body trembled with fear and sorrow as his words sank in. Outside, they heard the faint hum of a vehicle arriving to fetch her. Panic overtook Chanty as she quickly wiped her tears, unsure whether to face the king or not. Vasper pulled her into another embrace, holding her tightly. "Don't resist the king's will. Play along with their games, and everything will fall into place. Jake is waiting for you there," he said softly, releasing her and giving her an encouraging smile. But Chanty couldn't move from where she stood. Her feet felt rooted to the ground, paralyzed by doubt and fear. The soft buzz of music echoed through her room. It was the door chime. Mara was here. Vasper walked Chanty to the door and opened it to reveal Mara, smiling politely. "Miss Chanty," Mara greeted, bowing slightly to Vasper. "Your Majesty." "Take her, Mara," Vasper said with a nod. Chanty hesitated, her mind a chaotic mess. She turned back to look at Vasper one last time, her heart heavy. Despite her reluctance, she forced herself to step toward the vehicle waiting outside. As the door closed behind her, she looked out the window and saw Vasper watching her from afar. In an instant, the vehicle teleported, and the scenery changed. Chanty found herself once again in the royal palace. She was now in the grand hallway leading to the king's chamber. 6 guardians, including Jake, stood waiting for her, their expressions grim and unreadable. Chanty glanced at each of their faces, noticing the tension that filled the air. Among them stood 5 envoys, their presence imposing. Jake's face caught her attention, his eyes restless, his features weary as if he hadn't slept in days. His sorrow was palpable, weighing heavily on her heart. In that moment, it felt as though their bond had been severed. Jake took a step toward her, reaching for her hand, but Jacob intercepted him with a sharp gesture. Chanty flinched at Jacob's sudden action, startled. David motioned for her to sit on the sofa across from them, and she hesitantly complied. The guardians followed suit, their movements deliberate, their eyes never leaving her. The tension in the room was suffocating. Chanty glanced at Jake again, her guilt and sorrow mounting. His suit was immaculate, yet his tired eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. She couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze fully. The weight of her choices pressed heavily on her chest, and she felt as though an invisible wall had been erected between them. Suddenly, the room shifted as King Elander Valaner entered, exuding power and authority. His regal attire and crown commanded respect, and the 5 envoys immediately lined up behind him. Everyone stood and bowed in unison, acknowledging the king's presence. With a single raised hand, he signaled for them to sit again. Shanta's heart pounded as she watched him, her anxiety intensifying. Before she could say anything, Jake's gaze found hers once more, his eyes filled with worry and unspoken emotions. His expression was so raw, so transparent, that it left no doubt about his feelings. Chanty could only wonder, was her turmoil as visible to him as his was to her? The king's commanding voice echoed through the room, resonating with undeniable authority. "Don Lorenzo," he began, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Tomorrow marks the beginning of your mission. For you, this task may seem difficult, but if you truly focus on your duty, it will not be impossible to accomplish." The weight of his words struck Chanta like a bolt of lightning. She stared at the king, her face betraying her shock. "Your mother," the king continued, "took down 5 kings during her service to me and to the kingdom of the Sylvan Concord." Shanta's breath hitched, her eyes wide as she looked at him. Her expression, full of disbelief and fear, did not escape the notice of the guardians or of Jake, who stood nearby. Anxiety began to bloom in her chest, her thoughts racing with the possibilities of what the king might say next. "Jake Valerian," the king said, shifting his attention to the guardian. "Surely, you now understand my wishes. I place far more trust in you than in Vasper Mondragon as an ally of this kingdom." Jake lowered his head in a gesture of acknowledgement, his jaw tightening. The king's piercing gaze returned to Chanty. "I only issue my orders once. Let there be no misunderstandings between us." He leaned forward, his voice laced with finality. "Don Lorenzo, during the Twilight Reckoning, I expect you to end Alexander Mondragon's reign. Following that, we will secure the allegiance of Velantis Noctem, largely thanks to Vasper Mondragon. I owe him immense gratitude, most of all for his obsession with your beauty. It's clear he cares for nothing and no one else but you. There is no doubt, you will be the queen of Velantis Noctem." His words reverberated throughout the chamber, filling it with tension. The guardians exchanged looks of silent sympathy, save for Jake, whose face was a storm of worry and pain. His eyes, glassy and tormented, betrayed the emotions he struggled to suppress. Chanty, meanwhile, felt weightless, as though her feet no longer touched the ground. "After your marriage," the king continued, "and the unification of our kingdoms, Vasper Mondragon must be eliminated within 3 months. Chanty's heart raced, pounding so loudly she was certain the others could hear it. She stood frozen, her mouth agape, staring at the king. Then her gaze darted to Jake, who looked at her with a stern intensity, trying to read her reaction. The guardians watched her just as closely, their faces masks of stone. "I see that you do not desire Vasper Mondragon," the king stated matter-of-factly. "And Jake Valerian will be the one you marry. He will be your king once Vasper Mondragon is gone." Chanty's trembling hands clenched into fists at her sides as the king continued. "You have 3 options to eliminate Vasper," he said, his tone chillingly casual. "The first is with your own hands. Scenarios have been prepared to ensure the incident appears accidental, sparing you from blame." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The second is through a mysterious illness. A special wine, the finest in the Sylvan Concord, has been crafted for such missions. If you serve it to him over the course of a month, his body will deteriorate, and he will succumb to the illness." Chanty's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening. "And the third option," the king said, "should the first 2 fail, the 6 guardians, led by Jake Valerian, will finish Vasper Mondragon for you." Jake's gaze bore into Chanty, deadly serious, as the king's words settled over the room like a dark cloud. Chanty, her mind reeling, realized with devastating clarity that everything Vasper had told her was true. She forced herself to stay composed, even as her heart seethed with anger and her chest ached with sorrow. "When Vasper is gone," the king declared, "you will have 3 months to declare your king and husband anew. That is when Jake Valerian will step in. Your desires will be fulfilled, and there will be no obstacles in your path. Peace and prosperity in the inner world will be assured." His authoritative tone allowed no room for debate. "David and the guardians will ensure that everything agreed upon here today is carried out as planned. No one else must know of this." Without further discussion, the king turned and strode toward his quarters, his regal robes trailing behind him. The 5 envoys stepped forward, signaling that the meeting was over and that everyone was dismissed. The guardians rose with an air of power, their steps firm and purposeful as they exited the room. Chanty followed them, her legs unsteady, each step threatening to give way beneath her. Jake hesitated near the doorway, glancing back to check on her. "Not here, Jake," Gabriel said, pulling him away. "Outside." Jake reluctantly followed, leaving Chanty to gather herself as the weight of the king's orders pressed heavily upon her. Her hands trembled, and her mind swirled with anguish, anger, and fear. Jake hurriedly exited the room, while Chanty also made her way out, her pace quick but her intentions clear. She had no desire to speak with Jake. She moved briskly toward her vehicle, but before she could reach it, Jake grabbed her hand. She turned to face him, her eyes sharp yet weary. "We have no choice but to follow his plans for our future," Jake pleaded, his voice laced with desperation. "It pains me, but I have no option but to obey." Please, this is the only way for us to be together again, to be married legally. Chanty pulled her hand away, her face expressionless. She said nothing, turning away to step into her vehicle. Jake stood there, stunned, watching her with an intense, serious gaze. I'll do everything to fulfill the king's wishes, Chanty, Jake called after her. For both of us. Chanty met his gaze briefly, tears silently streaming down her face. She closed the vehicle door without another word, fighting to keep herself from breaking down completely. The vehicle teleported back to the dome, where, upon arrival, Vasper stood waiting outside, clearly anticipating her return. His smile brightened as he watched her step out of the vehicle. The sight of Vasper pierced Chanty's heart. The overwhelming pain she felt at that moment was too much to bear. Unable to hold back, she ran to him and embraced him tightly, her sobs spilling out with all the anguish she had been holding in. Vasper lifted her effortlessly and carried her inside to their quarters, laying her gently on the bed. He lay down beside her, propped himself up on his elbow, and gazed at her tear-streaked face. Why? What happened? Vasper asked softly, his brows furrowed with concern. Did you meet with Jake? Chanty remained silent, her eyes fixed on him. Finally, she spoke, her voice breaking with emotion. You were right, she admitted, her words nearly inaudible. Everything you said, it's what the king ordered me to do. Vasper gave a small, bitter smile. See? I told you, he replied casually. Chanty stared at him in disbelief. How do you know these things? She asked in a hushed tone. Vasper's gaze deepened, and his voice grew serious. Because of my past, he began. I was a womanizer. Every beautiful woman in the inner world, whether they were the wives of rulers or not, I pursued them. And through them, I learned secrets, things that were never meant to be revealed. That's how some kingdoms gained power, forming alliances by dethroning rulers through manipulative tactics. It's an old game, and the Sylvan Concord plays it better than anyone. His explanation left Chanty speechless. Her mouth hung open as she processed his words, a gesture that tempted Vasper to kiss her. He did, their lips meeting in a passionate exchange. When they pulled apart, Vasper's expression softened. Why did you agree to the king's game? Chanty asked, her voice trembling. You knew it would endanger you. Instead of answering with words, Vasper kissed her again, this time with tenderness, love, and longing. The kiss lasted long, deepening their connection. For you, Vasper finally whispered. I don't want you to end up like your mother, who died so young. Like the mothers of the Guardians, who lost their lives because they defied missions like these. Now I understand, it's not the Mondragons hunting them. It's the Sylvan Concord, systematically eliminating them while framing the Mondragon clan for their crimes. They're protecting the secrets of the inner world at all costs. Chanty's breath hitched, her fear growing. My mother was an assassin? She asked, her voice shaking. Vasper fell silent, his gaze unwavering. Tears welled up in Chanty's eyes as the truth sank in. Vasper reached for a blanket, gently wiping away her tears. But don't worry, he said softly. If you follow the king's wishes, you and Jake will rule like the other rulers who lived long, fruitful lives, raising children, even grandchildren. That's the life I want for you. Chanty's sobs grew louder. I can't do that, she whispered, her voice breaking. Then just give me the wine, Vasper said with a faint smile. I'll drink it every day. No. No. Chanty cried, clutching him tightly. You're not going to die, Vasper. Don't leave me. Vasper froze, caught off guard by her words. He remained still for a moment, then wrapped his arms around her in a firm embrace. I'm sorry for what I said earlier when you arrived, Chanty confessed through her tears. It was my jealousy talking, jealousy of the women in your life. But I don't want to lose you. Vasper, I love you so much. I don't want to live without you. Vasper laughed softly, his eyes sparkling with joy as he gazed at her. Is that what I just heard? He teased. Chanty didn't reply. Instead, she kissed him fervently, and he returned the kiss just as passionately. They held each other tightly, as if trying to merge into one, leaving no space between them. As they pulled apart, their eyes locked. "I thought Jake was the one you wanted to be with," Vasper said playfully, his lips brushing against hers, teasing her. Chanty shook her head. "Earlier, in the king's presence, I realized something," she whispered. "I can't lose you. I can't bear it." Tears rolled down her cheeks again. "David and the Guardians, it's their mission to eliminate you after we're married. The king gave me only 3 months." Shanta's voice broke as she sobbed harder, clinging to Vasper. He held her close, his heart swelling with both pain and happiness. "I've been in this world far longer than Jake or David," Vasper said gently, stroking Shanta's hair. Chanty remembered Jake's words about him being over 200 years old. "When did you stop aging?" she asked. "At 28 years old," Vasper replied with a smile. "But my real age is much older than Jake's." Chanty wasn't surprised. She had read about Vasper's lineage in the library, along with details about the Guardians. "I don't like grandpas," she murmured, her voice soft but clear. "Oh, really?" Vasper teased, his tone playful. "Do I look like a grandpa to you?" He leaned in and nibbled at her neck, making her giggle softly. "No," Chanty replied, laughing even through her tears. Vasper paused, looking at her with amusement. "You're beautiful, my queen. I want to see you smiling and laughing always," he said warmly. "But tell me honestly, do I look like an old man?" Shanta's expression turned serious. "Yes, you're an old man. The most beautiful old man I've ever seen, and I hate it." Vasper bit his lower lip, holding back his laughter at her strange but heartfelt compliment. His striking features seemed even more captivating as he gazed at her, leaving Chanty mesmerized. "What if David attacks you?" Chanty asked, her voice trembling with worry. "That won't happen as long as you choose the wine," Vasper replied calmly. "It's more peaceful and comes with fewer issues. Everyone will see my death as normal." In response, Chanty playfully slapped his arm. "Don't say that again," she scolded, her stern gaze fixed on him. "I don't want any of that to happen," Chanty said desperately. "What should I do?" Vasper smiled faintly. "Who do you want to spend your life with? That's where we'll decide what needs to be done." Chanty fell silent, her emotions a storm inside her chest. "Vasper, I want you to live. I don't want you to die," she finally said, her voice breaking as tears threatened to fall. "I'm not afraid to die, my queen," Vasper replied softly. "I've lived my fill in this world. To be honest, I'm tired." Her eyes widened in shock as her tears started streaming. "What? You're tired of living?" she asked, her voice trembling. Vasper looked at her seriously, wiping her tears gently with his fingers. "Yes. I have no desire to live long if I can't have you by my side. I've had enough of life, of women, of everything. I have no other longing but you. But if you want Jake, that means I'd have to live alone in this world. If that's the case, it's better that I disappear." Hearing this, Chanty broke into sobs, her anguish spilling out in waves. She clung to him tightly. "I hate you, Vasper. You're so dumb and stupid," she cried while hiccuping through her tears. Vasper chuckled lightly. "Yes, I know I am. No need to remind me, it hurts, you know." Her tears mingled with soft laughter as she punched him lightly on the shoulder. "Do I really have to spell it out?" Chanty said, her voice still trembling. "You're the one I want to be with, Vasper. I've changed my mind completely since earlier, in front of the king." Vasper stared at her, stunned by her declaration. They locked eyes, a deep silence falling between them. Slowly, he reached out and traced her lips with his fingers. Chanty caught his finger, pulling it into her mouth, her tongue teasingly brushing against it. Vasper's eyes darkened as heat surged through him, his self-control snapping. He leaned in and captured her lips fervently, devouring her breath, her taste, her very essence. Their hands moved with desperate urgency, tossing away their clothes until they lay bare upon the bed. The room filled with the sounds of their passion, gasping breaths, whispered moans, and Chanty's cries of pleasure. Again and again, Vasper brought her to the peak of ecstasy, careful to preserve her innocence. At last, their bodies collapsed together, trembling and spent, their hearts pounding in unison. "I love you, my queen," Vasper whispered repeatedly, his words a vow of eternal devotion. Chanty smiled, her fingers tracing his lips. "Now I've decided, my life is with you, through joy and sorrow," she said softly. Vasper's laughter was filled with bliss as he embraced her tightly. "My happiness has no equal now. Please, don't ever take this away from me," he murmured. Chanty smiled again. "Never, Vasper. I promise." They held each other close until their passion flared anew, their bodies entwining once more. Their intimate moment was only interrupted when Chanty's food delivery device buzzed. Chanty stood, laughing as she grabbed a bathrobe to cover herself. Vasper did the same, wrapping his robe over his bare body. When Chanty opened the door, Mara entered with several elves, all carrying trays of food. The sight of their scattered clothes on the floor didn't escape Mara's notice, especially Chanty's lace panties lying in plain view. Embarrassed, Chanty blushed furiously and hurried to gather the garments, with Vasper helping her, chuckling all the while. Mara excused herself quickly, flustered, as the elves followed her out. After closing the door, Vasper pulled Chanty into another playful embrace, kissing her passionately. "Before we eat, you'll be my breakfast," he teased, lifting her effortlessly and laying her back on the bed. Their passion ignited once more, Chanty's cries of pleasure filling the room. When they finally finished, they sat together at the round table, sharing their meal. The table, meant for two, overflowed with dishes, some originating from the outer world. Chanty picked at her food, only interested in the fruits and juices she preferred over the inner world's cuisine. She loved the desserts in the inner world, almost always having edible gold as decoration. And most especially, she enjoyed their wine. Meanwhile, Vasper, dressed only in boxers and with his long hair cascading over his shoulders, was intensely focused on Chanty as they ate together. Chanty blushed, her face turning redder each time their eyes met. "I'm so happy right now. If you didn't have a schedule tomorrow, I'd want us to go to our private island in paradise," Vasper said, his hand resting on Chanty's thigh, gently caressing the sensitive skin. Chanty playfully swatted his hand. "Vasper, let's eat," she said, trying to refocus him. Instead of listening, Vasper lifted her and placed her on his lap. Chanty had no choice but to go along with his whims. He continued staring at her while she ate, making her cheeks flush even more. "Aren't you going to eat?" she asked him. Vasper smiled and replied, "I'm full. I had breakfast with the king, and we also had snacks on his balcony." Chanty looked at him seriously. "How can you face him, knowing he has such evil plans against you? I can't believe how power-hungry and controlling he is." Vasper smiled faintly. "That's how kings are. Their thoughts are constantly consumed by ways to expand their territory, strengthen their power, and control their surroundings to improve their kingdom," he said softly, eating an apple. Chanty stared at him, puzzled. "Aren't you angry at him? How can you not be mad when he wants to kill you?" she asked, observing how calm and unbothered Vasper seemed despite the plot against his life. Vasper chuckled quietly. "Actually, I'm grateful for what happened," he said casually, leaving Chanty stunned mid-bite. "Because of his lust for power and corruption, he ended up helping me reunite with you. Look at us now. If it weren't for his ambitions, I wouldn't have been able to win you back from Jake," Vasper explained. Chanty was speechless, staring at him in disbelief. "There's nothing more important to me than you. You matter more than my life, my queen," Vasper said, holding her face and kissing her. "But Vasper, he wants to kill you," Chanty insisted. Vasper smiled. "Then you and Jake would finally have no obstacles. All that matters is we get married first," he replied, making Chanty clench her fists in frustration. "Earlier, when I faced the king, I realized something," Chanty said softly, her voice trembling as tears welled in her eyes. "I only feel pity for Jake. I appreciate everything he's done for me, but he loves me, and I also love him, Vasper," Chanty said, her tears flowing. Vasper fell silent, looking at her with deep understanding. "But I realized I can't live without you," she added, making Vasper smile faintly, though he seemed close to tears as well. He gently wiped her tears with his fingers. "You've grown attached to him because he's always been by your side. I see it. He loves you just as much as I do. That's why I'm confident that if I'm no longer around, he'll take care of you," Vasper said softly. "This is all my fault," he admitted. "If only I hadn't divided your feelings before. Your entire heart should have been mine, but now a part of it belongs to Jake," he said, full of understanding. "I don't want him to go to Velantis Noctem to fight. I don't want his path to cross with Alexander Mondragon," Chanty said. "He's still important to me," she whispered. Vasper smiled gently. "He won't listen to that. He won't agree to stay behind while you're out there fighting. He loves you, Chanty. And I know his actions are driven by the same love I feel for you," Vasper said. Chanty lowered her head, unable to hide her concern for Jake. "Want some advice? Give him wine laced with sleeping medicine. That should knock him out for 24 hours, Vasper suggested casually. Chanty stared at him, unsure if he was serious. Vasper laughed. "What, you think I'm joking? Before, I wouldn't have felt this way. Jealousy? I never imagined I'd feel this because of a woman. But now? It hurts seeing the one I love showing concern for another man," Vasper admitted with a bitter smile. Chanty reflected on his words, realizing the weight of his emotions. Turning away, she couldn't hide her concern for Jake. "He's still important to me, Vasper," she said softly. "I know," Vasper replied, bowing his head. "There are so many things I've felt since we became involved, things I never experienced before. Jealousy, incomparable joy, unbearable pain, anger, and the overwhelming longing for a woman that drives me crazy. I feel like I'll lose my mind when I can't see you," Vasper confessed, hugging Chanty tightly. Chanty listened silently, feeling the depth of his emotions. "All the mistakes I made in the past with women, I'm paying for them now," Vasper said frankly. Chanty, listening, couldn't believe how open he was being with her. "Seeing you with Jake feels like being stabbed with a knife. The pain is indescribable, I want to go wild. But the reality that I caused all this is the only thing keeping me grounded," he added. Tears streamed down Chanty's face. "Is it the same pain I felt seeing you with Samara in bed? Hearing your cries of pleasure together?" Chanty asked, her voice breaking. Vasper looked at her, his eyes reddened. He gently wiped her tears. "I'm so sorry." "Yes, it's just as painful," Vasper admitted. "And for the first time in my life, I'm crying because of a woman," he added. Chanty wiped her tears as she stared at Vasper, then drank some water to steady herself. Vasper picked her up and carried her to the bed. They both sat down, with Vasper leaning against the headboard and Chanty resting against his chest, seated between his thighs. Vasper's arm wrapped around her protectively, and Chanty leaned her head against his chest. "I never thought the King Elander I once hated would become my favorite person now," Vasper said, laughing and shaking his head. Chanty looked up at him. "But he still wants you gone, Vasper. And the Guardians, they're playing a game I don't want to be part of. What does it mean that they're my enemies now? I see David and his siblings as family, and I don't want our relationship ruined," she said. "Don't worry," Vasper reassured her. "We'll face the king together after our wedding, along with the Guardians. But by that time, Jake won't agree to any of it. He'll fight for his love for you," Vasper said, watching Chanty's reaction closely. He kissed her on the lips. "Jake won't surrender your marriage, right now. I'm the most hated person in his world," Vasper said. Chanty's mind flashed back to Jake's pale, sorrowful face earlier. Her heart ached, but she had no choice. Her feelings for Vasper were stronger, and she couldn't bear the thought of Jake getting hurt. Vasper gently cradled Chanty's head against his arm, positioning her so their faces were inches apart. Their eyes met, a collision of emotions that transcended words. Their gazes were locked in an intense, silent battle, filled with unspoken love and longing. Vasper's eyes carried the weight of raw desire, while Chanty's reflected a conflicted vulnerability. Vasper's emotions surged with unrelenting intensity. His feelings for Chanty were a storm of ache and passion, magnified by the pain of seeing her by Jake's side. It gnawed at him, a relentless torment. He wanted to reclaim her, to fill the voids he had left in her heart, and to erase the loneliness that had once defined their separation. The thought of winning Chanty back felt like the greatest triumph of his life, surpassing even the perilous adventures he had endured. "I can't believe I got you back from Jake," Vasper murmured, his voice trembling with emotion as he gently caressed Chanty's face. She looked into his eyes, her expression unreadable, as if listening to the whispers of his heart. "When I heard you were married," Vasper continued, his voice dropping to a deep, aching tone, "I felt like dying." Chanty flinched slightly, her thoughts pulling her to the memory of her wedding with Jake. The images flooded her mind, vows exchanged, dreams shared. She turned her gaze away, her chest tightening with the weight of what had been and what could never fully be again. Despite everything, a part of her heart still held space for Jake, a space built from love, pity, and bittersweet memories. Vasper noticed the change in her mood, the shift in her expression. Chanty attempted to rise from her resting position against his arm, but Vasper stopped her. His stern gaze bore into her, firm yet laced with pain. Tears welled in Chanty's eyes, spilling over as the memories of her life with Jake replayed in her mind. The mansion they had called home, Jake's unwavering devotion, the bouquets of flowers he gifted her every day, all of it haunted her. She couldn't hold back the tears that streaked down her cheeks as she looked at Vasper. "I should have started over with Jake that day when I returned from the island," Chanty whispered, her voice barely audible but sharp enough to pierce Vasper's heart. "So many times, I failed him because of you. So many times, I betrayed him for you." Her voice trembled with pain and regret. "And yet, all he ever gave me was unconditional love I didn't deserve." "You've done nothing wrong," Vasper countered, his voice soft yet firm, as though trying to console not just her but himself. "Everything I've done was to get you back. From the beginning, you were mine. Jake knew it. You knew it." His voice cracked under the weight of his emotions, his composure beginning to crumble. He wiped away her tears with a gentle touch before leaning in, capturing her lips in a kiss, fierce, longing, and resolute. Their lips met, trembling with the storm of emotions between them. Chanty didn't respond, she allowed him to kiss her, feeling the desperation and love that consumed him. "I love you," Vasper whispered repeatedly against her lips, his voice breaking with sobs. "You are my life, my light, my everything." Tears began streaming from Chanty's eyes as well, and Vasper pulled her into a tight embrace. "Thank you for coming back to me," he said softly. "I'm sorry for dragging the past into this, but I had to fight for you." Chanty lay silently in his arms, gazing at his face with an expression that spoke of inner turmoil. Her thoughts remained tangled, circling back to Jake, the guilt, the love, and the foreboding prophecy of the Sword of Destiny. It clung to her like a shadow. Vasper, as if sensing her hesitation, kissed her once more, this time with an aching hunger. His lips pressed against hers with a mix of passion and demand, as though trying to bridge the gaps between their hearts. His hands roamed her body, deliberate and searching. Chanty gasped softly as his touch sent waves of electricity through her, his warmth igniting something deep within her. Vasper's hand slid to the tie of her bathrobe, unfastening it with ease. The robe slipped from her shoulders and tossed it to the floor. He positioned himself between her legs, which instinctively parted for him, and their lips remained locked in an intense, feverish kiss. "I can't get enough of you, my queen," he murmured against her lips, his voice filled with both reverence and hunger. As his hands explored her body, Chanty's breath hitched. Her mind was a battlefield of guilt, longing, and surrender. She felt her walls crumbling under the weight of Vasper's touch, his love, and the undeniable connection they shared. As Vasper's hands played over Chanty's sensitive skin, they were filled with reverence and longing. Chanty's body arched in response, soft moans escaping from her throat. The sound of her voice mingled with Vasper's devouring breaths, their moans and groans blending together with the rhythm of their bodies moving on the bed. Chanty's arms wrapped tightly around Vasper's back as he drove her wild with his torturous rhythm, his fiery touch and burning kisses igniting every part of her body. Amidst their heated romance, Vasper whispered in Chanty's ear, "I love you so much, my queen. I can't wait to claim you completely right after our wedding." His voice was full of tenderness as his hand caressed her sensitive skin between her thighs with a gentleness overflowing with love. Chanty could only answer with soft moans as Vasper's lips recaptured hers in a devouring kiss. From her lips to her neck and down to her breasts, Vasper's lips and tongue tasted every inch of Chanty's skin, leaving no part untouched. He moved lower to her stomach, her thighs, and even to her feet, pressing kisses on every part of her body. Even her soles and toes were not spared from Vasper's warm lips and tongue until he paused between her thighs, devouring her with the intensity of his love and desire. Chanty, her mouth slightly open, watched as Vasper's actions unraveled her. Her hand clutched his hair while the other braced itself against the bed. As Vasper's tongue explored her, their gazes met, his eyes locked with hers, and Chanty's loud moans deepened the fire within him. His tongue expertly moved, teasing and tasting, drawing a reaction that made Chanty bite her lower lip to suppress the overwhelming pleasure. She could feel the heat building in her body, even stronger than before. Her moans grew louder, her breathing quicker, her heart racing as she chased the pleasure overwhelming her senses. Vasper felt her body tremble as she neared her peak. Chanty's back hit the bed as her hips bucked and her thighs quivered, her moans deepening as her body surrendered to the waves of pleasure. Vasper kneaded her breasts with purpose, as if silently urging her to let go. Chanty cried out his name, her body stiffening as she reached the peak of her ecstasy, her thighs trembling and her cries sounding like music to Vasper's ears. His tongue felt her muscles pulsing, her sensitive skin glistening and wet with her release. Even after her climax subsided, Vasper continued to gently taste her with tenderness and love, ensuring she was completely soothed. His fingers caressed the sensitive area before him with deep affection. Chanty, her breath still ragged, felt Vasper's lips capture hers in another consuming kiss. "You're so beautiful, my queen. I love watching you enjoy yourself like this, and I love it even more knowing I'm the reason," Vasper whispered against her lips. Chanty blushed at his words, shyness coloring her features. Vasper's hand lingered on her sensitive skin, one finger slipping teasingly between her folds. Occasionally, he moved it slightly, reigniting the heat in Chanty's body as their lips locked once more. Each subtle movement sent sparks coursing through Chanty, her body responding despite the tenderness she had just experienced. Vasper's lips moved again, this time shifting between her lips and breasts, leaving a trail of kisses that stoked the embers of their desire. "You're the only one who satisfies me like this, but I'll never get enough of you. I want to take you to heaven every single time we're together," Vasper murmured against her skin, his voice dripping with passion. Chanty flushed even deeper at his words, finding his vocal expressions during their intimate moments to be both overwhelming and endearing. Vasper had always been like this, unafraid to voice his emotions, while Chanty sometimes wished for quieter gestures. As Vasper laid back, he gently guided Chanty to sit up, positioning her atop his face. She hesitated momentarily but complied, her knees straddling him as he continued to devour her with his mouth and tongue. Chanty's legs trembled, her body overwhelmed by the sensations his actions created. Her hands gripped the headboard for support, her soft moans filling the room as Vasper's hands kneaded her breasts in rhythm with the movement of his tongue. Their groans and moans blended into a symphony of passion. Eventually, Chanty leaned forward, her body collapsing against Vasper's as she sought to return the favor. Together, they explored each other's bodies with equal fervor, their movements sinking as they chased the pleasure they both craved. Their breaths mingled, their cries growing louder as the moment of bliss neared. When Chanty could no longer hold back, her lips left Vasper's hardness, her hand taking over to bring him to the edge. Vasper's body tensed, his release spilling over her hand as Chanty moaned in delight at the sight and sensation she felt. Exhausted, Chanty collapsed, her head resting on Vasper's thigh. Her breath came in short gasps, but her hand remained tightly wrapped around him. Vasper gently caressed her, his lips pressing tenderly against her skin. He shifted her body back onto the bed, smiling at her as she lay there, spent and flushed. Carefully, he wiped her hand clean, his kisses finding her cheeks as she blushed again. "You're exhausted, aren't you?" he asked, his voice filled with playful apology. "Sorry, But I can't promise you won't always feel like this when you're by my side. Chanty smiled weakly, and Vasper chuckled softly, adding, we haven't even reached the climax yet, have we? Just wait until I can fully make you mine, completely. Chanty's tired eyes met his, her expression shy but content. Even now, I feel like I've reached heaven. There's no joy that can compare to this, he whispered, and Chanty's heart swelled at his words. I love you so much, he said, kissing her softly once more. They wrapped themselves in a blanket, the coolness of the room stark against the warmth of their bodies. Chanty gazed at Vasper in silence, her heart filled with love. Vasper, amused by her reaction, couldn't stop watching her. I love you, my queen, he said again. If it were up to me, I'd never let you rest. I can't get enough of you. I love you so much, he repeated, his voice filled with sincerity and longing.